Hello, I'm Professor Hill with QD Learning, and I'm here to talk about the public forum topic, which was released a few days ago. It is the September-October 2024 topic, and it reads, "The United States federal government should substantially expand its surveillance infrastructure along its southern border." We're going to look at, first of all, some definitions, go through and see where there are arguments you can make on both sides. Then we're going to look at ground. We're going to look at several issues you can run for cases on the affirmative and arguments you might use to create disadvantages or negative attacks. So let's get right into it. Once again, this is brought to you by QD Learning. If you are interested in receiving top-notch debate coaching or classes in business, investing, and all manner of forensics events, we offer this, and you can find out more about that at www.qdlearning.com. Okay, my background is I have been in the debate world for decades. I started back in the early 90s. I did seated debate. I did all kinds of policy debate. And I've been coaching and teaching debate for over 30 years. So even though this might be a new topic, I'm finding that a lot of the arguments are going to be pretty much the same as they were decades ago. All right, with that being said, let's get into it. First, let's talk about definitions. Now, when I teach definitions, I like to explain the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which basically states that language creates reality. This is incredibly important for you as a debater because the language you use in your case, in your negative case, in rebuttals, these are the words that are going to shape the picture in the judge's mind. Ultimately, the judge is going to vote on the picture that you've created in their mind using that language. So be very, very careful about the language you use. And this is why definitions and definitional arguments are so important. Definitions serve to expand or mitigate impacts. They also serve to divide ground. For example, what is the United States federal government's approach versus a hired or outsourced military's approach? First definition is the United States federal government. First question you have to ask is, who is this? It's a giant organization. Who specifically are you using as your agent of action? Or who specifically are you arguing is making a mistake and needs to be changed? Next is outsourcing. Keep in mind that the U.S. Fed outsources a lot of stuff when it comes to intelligence, enforcement, military action. So make sure that the impacts that you have or your opponent has are stemming from the U.S. federal government and not outsourced organizations or divisions. Next is covert. Remember, when it comes to surveillance, there's a lot of covert organizations out there and a lot of covert action that we may not be privy to. How do we bring this up in these particular cases or these particular rounds? It's going to get interesting. Also, there is the fact that the United States government is always governed by a set of rules. They can't just run out and do something. There's all kinds of standards, procedures, and documents that must be followed. So the idea that you're just going to make it happen through fiat. No. There's many barriers, bureaucratic barriers, attitudinal barriers that have to be dealt with before you can claim the impacts. I think the chief way you're going to use this definition is in mitigation, pointing out that certain actions are not being taken by the United States federal government. Therefore, they don't count. You have to be open to arguments of attitudinal barriers and optics. Remember, in this day and age of social media, everything you do is being watched, and what you do is also being spun by spin doctors. So when the United States federal government does anything, it is the optics that are mostly going to be the links to the disad. Things like elections disads, things like the country losing faith or civil war impacts. All of these are going to stem from the optics of what's going on. And face it, the federal government always has bad optics as well as good ones. All right, Here are some of the disads that you are going to run into. Mindset disads, that if we're focusing on that, we're not focusing on something else. Or racism would be an idea of a mindset disad. Power vacuum, if we do something, then Mexico won't. Or if we do it, Mexico will. Elections, obviously, this is a hot topic in elections with the arguments that Kamala Harris is a border czar and that Trump didn't finish the wall. So there's all kinds of elections impacts or links here. History, we can look at the history and say historically we've had a problem with racism, or historically the U.S. federal government has used surveillance negatively. There will be those links. And then, of course, there's agendas. When we look at states like Texas or even politicians, there are different agendas that people have that are going to get involved and pork-barreled in legislation when it comes to doing something about the border. All of these open the door for cases and, of course, disads and various impacts. Moving on to should. Obviously, it's going to come down to, is this a policy or value? On face value, with the word should, you want to go policy, but not necessarily. We can argue that something should be done from a philosophical stance and a philosophical criteria. Substantially. How do you measure substantially? You're going to need a rubric, and it's going to be one you're going to have to uphold during the entire round. You can have an example of what constitutes substantially, or you can have a specific measuring stick, and those are out there that say substantial must be 50%, 60%. But here's the thing. If there is not a significant or substantial change in the infrastructure, then definitionally, that case should not be allowed. Expand its. The term of its tells us that we need to do something with something that already exists. So cases that are creating a new branch or rebranding, I don't know that that's actually expanding its. It might be replacement. It might be substitute, but the definition, or excuse me, the definitions in the resolution specifically say expand. There is also the argument of expansion versus increase. Growth, for example. Is growth expansion? There's vertical expansion and there's horizontal expansion. Vertical expansion, we are adding more people to Border Patrol. Horizontal expansion, we are increasing the reach of Border Patrol. So you've got to look at expansion versus increase. Otherwise, you're going to get cases where people bring in 100,000 new border agents and claim the advantages off that, but they haven't really expanded. They maybe grown it, but they haven't expanded. All right, what else expands? When you are looking at the expansion of a government organization, obviously some things are going to be hurt. You're going to have funding, taking from one area of funding to the other. You're going to have political capital that is now spent on another area. You're also going to step on other people's toes. What happens to the Border Patrol agents if they're given free rein? What does that do to the local police? What does that do to the police on the other side of the border? It's going to cause problems. And that's where we have the meat for disad links. Okay, surveillance infrastructure. First of all, I want to note again that this is already existing, so they cannot create new surveillance infrastructure, or that gets into a definitional argument. Infrastructure means roots or foundation of something. So if they're only hiring a few people or doing some surface changes or a law change, if it does not affect the actual bones of the organization, can we accept that case or those arguments? I believe that it's going to require a deeper fix than just adding or increasing various elements. We're going to have an infrastructure restructure. And that's where we get into time frame arguments. When you're dealing with something big and bloated like the U.S. federal government and its organizations, nothing gets done fast. In debate, we tend to look at our debate rounds, or what we argue in our debate rounds, as though it's an episode of a Marvel movie where it's over in 2 hours. No. The amount of bureaucracy, legalese, hiring, HR, computers, all of the things that have to be put in place, you're talking years and years, not instantaneous. During those years, anything can kick in. Perception impacts, funding impacts. All of these are the political DAs. All of these kick in and beat the time frame of the actual advantages you might get from your plan. So be careful of time frame arguments. Another argument is surveillance means look and don't touch. So all of the impacts that one or the other side might be arguing from surveillance changes or changes in surveillance infrastructure, if we're only looking and we're not touching, that is two different things. Yes, I see crimes being committed through my brand new fantastic surveillance infrastructure, but going out there to prevent those crimes or punishing or capturing those that have done the crimes, that's an entirely different department perhaps, maybe an entire different structure or infrastructure. That argument can be made. There needs to be a delineation between passive and active surveillance. Big difference. Are we watching? Does surveillance mean we go in and we prevent? What does it mean? And really quickly, as I'm looking through and beginning to research this topic, I see a lot about mass surveillance. Mass, how do you significantly increase something that's already mass? So that's a question that's also going to need to be handled in the definitions. Next, along its southern border. Now, that is a very, very strict location. It means that all of the impacts that either side is claiming from Border Patrol has to be mitigated down to only what takes place along the southern border. So be careful of cases where they're running generic border impact cards and they're not delineating how much of that impact happens along the southern border. So be careful. Also, this came up as maybe kind of a squirrelish idea, but a lot of the border between the United States and Mexico has Native American lands. And there's big questions about the federal government being able to march into Native American land and saying, hey, you need to control your border or we're going to do it for you. That begs all kinds of questions of bringing up all kinds of arguments concerning sovereignty and, of course, racism. Plan. Okay, if you do decide to run a plan based off the idea of should, make sure your actor is specifically under the auspices of the United States federal government. Look at enforcement. Enforcement then gets into the idea of, are you forcing the surveillance, meaning watching, or are you enforcing the laws through surveillance, and surveillance is just a tool that allows you to go bust people. You've got to figure that out in your plan and be clear. And of course, funding. Remember, funding doesn't necessarily need to come from the U.S. federal government. You can contract companies to do it, but then that gets into more definitional debates. Contentions. The only thing I want to say about contentions as we get ready to go through some ideas for contentions is keep it simple. Do not take a big, huge contention that is complicated and has all of these moving parts and links and then try to run that out and around. You're going to have confusion. Start with a basic, simple contention idea and then make it more advanced or complicated as you get used to running this topic. So how do you choose a contention? Keep it simple, something you can clearly research and understand. Okay, criteria. I like to call arguments against criteria alternative value accruement mechanism. And I just want to say this. It disheartens me as a judge to see how many debaters will run out of criteria and then forget about it completely all the way up to the end of the round. Both sides will forget about it. Remember what the criteria is. The criteria is the contract that you and the other team argue. It is the contract that says the way that we're going to decide this round is based on this particular value or idea. If you're not clear on what that value or idea is, and it's not brought up in rebuttals, how am I as a judge supposed to make a decision? Thank you. My decision is going to be based on the way we all decide, either through attrition or one side just flat out wins it. That is what I have to use to make the decision. So in rebuttals, your speech should be, Judge, we have decided on this criteria. This is the limits to how you can make this decision. And based on what we've given you, we uphold the criteria, we win. That's what I need to hear in rebuttals. If you're just repeating the same things your partner said over and over again, and you're expecting me as a judge to make the link and to use your criteria when you don't even mention it in rebuttals, it's not going to happen, and you're going to find yourself losing a lot of rounds. All right, first up, let's talk about AF cases. The first, obviously, is monitoring and controlling the spread of illness. COVID has taught us borders don't stop disease. But if we do kind of control the border and we can medicate people before or as they're coming through, we have a better chance of controlling the spread of disease. Again, that's a lot of money, and also that's a lot of extra things that the Border Patrol is going to have to do. The question is that a significant expansion, or is that just something we've always done? Next up is non-native species and the illegal trade in wildlife. I always think about how the person went down to Mexico and then they came back to Florida and they released an alligator in the toilet and it grew up, and now there's these species of alligators that Florida can't control. Now, I don't know if that's an urban myth or an urban legend, but I do know that transporting food and wildlife back across the border can destroy ecosystems and crops. Combating the illegal transportation of weapons and drugs. Obviously, we have an incredible fentanyl problem in the United States. And even though one can argue fentanyl's coming from the east, it's still coming through the U.S. border, a lot of it through the southern border. So to curtail weapons, to curtail drugs or anything else that might be coming through, maybe we need to strengthen our surveillance. All right, there have been a lot of claims made by various political parties that say that the people that are coming through because they're not adequately background checked, that they might be terrorists or that they're smuggling through biological agents. There are those that say there's no way to do anything about that without racial profiling. So that's going to come down to a debate of whether or not our fears of terrorism supersede our ability to be nice to people who happen to be of mixed race or a different color, ethnic background. Okay, diplomatic relationships between the United States and Mexico. Obviously, back when we had the Trump presidency, he argued he was going to make Mexico pay for the border. That didn't go well with Mexico. It hurt a lot of our trade and diplomatic relationships with Mexico. So remember, it's our southern border, but we are requiring Mexico to participate. You can see this with President Biden's new border bill, and I definitely recommend you go see that. It demonstrates, all of the problems we had and how we're trying to currently deal with it with the current surveillance system. And folks, it's not working. And part of the problem is that Mexico has its own ideas about how to handle it. And it's causing a lot of the issues that people are screaming about the Border Patrol having too much jurisdiction, being too difficult. Well, it's not just our Border Patrol agents. It's also the Mexican Border Patrol agents. How do we tell another sovereign country what to do with their border with us? It's going to be a good debate. Next, exercising influence and taking a leading role in global affairs. Now, this one gets kind of touchy because we have argued that many countries such as China and Russia are taking advantage of their neighbors and doing things with borders, changing them. I mean, I'm thinking about the 9-dash line with China. I'm thinking about what Vladimir Putin is doing over in Ukraine. If we start getting draconian in our border control efforts, and we start making refugees of people by forcing them to stay down in Mexico until we can do something about their citizenship status with the United States, I'm talking specifically about asylum seekers, are we the pot calling the kettle black? So remember, this is an optics thing, and this is where you're going to get a lot of disad links. We are being watched, and what we do gives the excuse or the motivation for other countries to do the same thing. A lot of disad room there. How do we oversee the responsibility and oversight of Border Patrol agents? We've got a huge problem with police, which has led to movements like defund the police. Well, are we going to have defund the Border Patrol? I mean, what do we do as far as training, as far as legalities? Are they covered by the same sort of legal protections that police officers are? We're going to have to take a look at the behavior of the border agents and what we're asking them to do. This is the agent of enforcement. What are they enforcing and how? Individuals' rights to privacy. This is going to be huge. When we're talking about surveillance, we're not just talking about the surveillance that takes place at the border. We're talking about an absolute increase in national surveillance and the AI and the technology that allows that to happen. And this is an optics issue. How can we have a surveillance state claiming that it's only for borders when you know it's going to be used throughout the United States, and then argue that China is wrong for having their surveillance activities? That's another, issue where the pot calls the kettle black, and we're going to have to debate that one out. Redirecting migrants towards riskier pathways. I don't know if you've ever been to San Diego, but as you get towards the border in San Diego, you see these signs that were put up many years ago. And supposedly these signs have saved many lives as people now watch out for people crossing the road. But the question is, if we are putting up a fence, does that just mean that they'll find another way in? If we are posting Border Patrol areas or Border Patrol in one area, well, does it mean that they'll now go up and try to come through Canada? And we're seeing that starting to happen. So are we solving the problem or just redirecting it to another border? Next is examining the effects of communities living near the border. When you put up a wall in someone's backyard, it changes the environment. And you can either live with it, as you see here, or you can try to fight it. But do we have the right to just put walls up and tell communities that they're going to be watched because they're harboring possible refugees, or they might be harboring migrants? Or do we have the right to do that? There are sovereignty issues here, and there's also issues of just plain civil rights. You can't deny that the Border Patrol has run-ins all the time with criminal organizations, cartels, etc. Is this an opportunity for us to advance the war on terror, or will we suffer from the war on terror? Is this an opportunity to advance more drug interdiction, which some people would classify as terrorism, or is it going to make things worse? I don't know. It's debatable. Next is the economic impact. There's a lot of argument here going back to migrant workers, the argument that they are stealing jobs, or is it that they're jobs that no one else wants? Well, regardless of how you debate this, you know that thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people coming across the border is definitely going to have an economic impact. It's definitely going to have a situation where now there's more competition for jobs and schooling and, of course, resources such as welfare and other public services. So these are things where we're going to have to weigh whether or not it's our responsibility. And a big question is our jobs, our economy, our everything. Is that what's bringing these people in the first place? And should we be doing that? Or should we be putting out the word worldwide, don't come here. This is ours, not yours. So definitely you're going to have a lot of economic disads. You're going to have a lot of job opportunity disads, probably going to lead to even some civil war scenarios, given the current climate. Could happen. All right. Civil liberties and racial discrimination. I'm not going to go into this, but it's very simple. When Border Patrol goes down to the border and they're trying to decide who belongs here and who doesn't belong here, does it necessitate racial profiling? And how do we deal with those things? And if a person has come here and they're being chased by someone else, what kind of liberties do they have? Currently, with the Biden administration, they have to stay in Mexico until their paperwork's processed, and then they may or may not be admitted. But should we be taking people directly at the border, bringing them in, protecting them until we get some sort of paperwork processed? Does that violate American civil liberties? I don't know. That's something we're going to have to look at. On the neg, I love this picture. You think that's a DJI drone? Okay. Are we going to make the situation worse? One thing we definitely do not want to do is make the situation worse by now seeing impacts that are going to directly affect everyone in the United States, not just the people coming into the United States. What do I mean? Well, you're talking about increased funding. You're talking about increased technology and AI, and here's where you can get technology bad or AI bad links. You're also going to have a situation where you are going to create more bureaucracy. You're going to create more court clog. You're going to create more situations where now social services have to be carved up even more. And of course, there are crime, drugs, and all the other things that are already bad. Are you going to make them worse? The size of the population. We are the second, no, we're not the second. We're one of the largest populations in the world, hovering somewhere between 400 and 500 million. If we take in tens of millions of people, how does that affect our population, our culture, the American way of doing things? Is this going to change who we are as the American people? Now, when we get into arguments of diversity, equity, and inclusion, does that automatically mean that people who make it here have the same rights and considerations as everyone else? You got to consider the size of the population. Can we support it? And what that increase in size does to the American way of life. Ensuring sufficient financial resources. Funding is always going to be an issue, especially on the negative. When you're talking about expansion of technology and people, that is going to be an incredible expansion of money. And you got to be able to show where that money comes from. And most importantly, that that money is not being taken away from some other critical program that we have in place. Disad City. We need to address the needs and challenges faced by refugees during humanitarian crises. Remember that there are times when we have hurricanes and other things where we throw the border open and we allow a lot more people in than we usually do. And a lot of people now are arguing that we can open the border using humanitarian as the reason for doing so. We're taking in refugees. They're not just migrants. Well, that argument goes back and forth. And so when we're looking at emergencies, for example, earthquakes or hurricanes in places like Haiti or Mexico, and those people need food, they need care. Does that mean that they get to walk into the United States and become United States citizens to get that care? That's going to be a good debate. Protecting against cyber threats and attack. Well, obviously, if we're upping our cyber game through surveillance technology, drones, AI, etc., we are also upping the risk of attacks. For example, at the border, currently, when they come through and if they are taking any biological material, if they're taking any kind of information, can that information be hacked by someplace like China and Russia and turned against us? Legitimate concerns. As war becomes less people and more computers, do we have the computer wherewithal to withstand certain threats and attacks, especially at the border? Hence why we're looking at upping our surveillance. But does surveillance, simply upping our surveillance game, guarantee safer protection from cyber threats and attacks? The fundamental right of seeking asylum is huge in this topic. What is the purpose for the person coming to the United States? Do we look at asylum cases as just general, everyone seeking asylum? How do we delineate asylum from a person who's just seeking a better life? Asylum from a person who's sneaking into the country for nefarious reasons? How we do this is instrumental to how we look at surveillance. We've got to be able to determine whether or not this person is coming in for the right reason and if they even deserve the protections that they would get coming into the United States. Then there's also preventing and ending inhumane detention practices. As I mentioned earlier, the United States government is huge with bureaucracy and legalities, et cetera, et cetera. So even though we know we want to treat people humanely, if you've got thousands of people coming in at once and we don't have the infrastructure set up to handle that or process that, it's going to naturally lead to inhumane detention practices. Not purposely, but until we figure out who, what, why, when, and where, what do we do with these people? So there are those arguments that by speeding it through in the name of being more humane, you're letting the wrong people in too quickly, and you're failing in the whole border security idea as a whole. You don't need to get fancy on this topic, even though you could, but whatever you do not get into an argument that you cannot handle. For example, if you jump into a capitalism debate and you're not deep on capitalism, you're going to lose. Don't even go down that road. Keep it very, very simple, very, very straightforward. Okay, I hope this was helpful. Again, my name is Professor Hill. You can call me Coach Hill. You can find me over at QD Learning. If you have questions, concern, or would like to hear more about what we're going to be doing on the topic and some sort of squirrelish ideas, as I sometimes like to run, you can let me know down in the comments. Let me know what you'd like to hear. If you'd like to hear more of these, I'd love to do them. If you'd like to hear some specific strategies, I can do those too. Just remember, we're over at qdlearning.com, or you can check us out right here. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.